She's a parasite!
He shouldn't talk to his wife like that.
Shut up, you filthy vegetable vendor!
In a packed courtroom in Lagos, the air felt thick like the calm before a violent storm. But no one expected that storm to begin with the very man standing at the center of the room. His expensive suit fit perfectly. His polished shoes reflected the cold courtroom lights. And then, he stood up, a crooked smirk, eyes filled with contempt. "Your Honor." His voice echoed slow, controlled yet sharp enough to slice through the silence. "This woman." He pointed straight at his wife. She stood there with her head lowered, her hands clenched so tightly they had turned pale. Her shoulders trembled as if one more word would shatter her completely. "Is nothing but a useless freeloader." The courtroom stirred. Whispers spread. A few heads shook, a few sighs, and even faint, judgmental smirks. But he wasn't done. No, he had no intention of stopping. He turned, his gaze locked onto the courtroom door as it slowly opened. An elderly woman stepped in. Worn clothes, faded sandals, a market bag still in her hand, carrying the scent of fresh soil and vegetables. She stood there out of place in a room filled with power and silent judgment. And then, he burst into laughter, a laugh that made the entire room feel colder. "And that is her mother." He pointed again, without hesitation. A filthy old vegetable seller from the market. A few quiet laughs followed. Eyes filled with disdain turned toward the old woman. The wife still silent, the mother still standing. But no one knew. In just a few minutes, no one in that courtroom would dare to laugh again. No one would even dare to breathe too loudly. And the man who laughed the loudest would be the first to wish he had never opened his mouth. If you're rewatching this story, tell me where you're rewatching from. Lagos, Accra. And if you believe that life can stay silent for a long time but justice never sleeps, subscribe now. Because what you're about to witness is not just a trial. It's the price of arrogance when it targets the wrong person. Stay until the very last second, because the moment that will leave the entire courtroom speechless hasn't even begun yet. His name was Chindu Okafor. In Lagos, that name was anything but unfamiliar. People spoke of him as a symbol of success, a sharp, cold-blooded businessman behind billion-dollar deals and powerful connections that made others lower their heads in quiet caution. Every time Chinadu appeared in the media, he was immaculate in expensive suits, a gleaming metal watch catching the flash of cameras, his lips curved into the half-smile of a man who believed he had never lost in his life. But very few people knew that before the luxury office towers, before the fleet of expensive cars lined up in his mansion's courtyard, before becoming the young mogul of Lagos, Chinadu had once been nothing more than a broke young man with an old wooden table, a few crumpled business plans, and a woman who sat beside him through long nights without electricity, without money, without any clear future. That woman was Ada. Ada was the kind of woman who turned heads with glamour. She didn't know how to manipulate people with sweet words, nor did she live for the approval of the crowd, but she possessed something far rarer. The resilience of a woman willing to invest her entire youth into the belief that the man she loved would one day succeed. When Chinadu failed his first deal, it was Ada who sold the earrings her mother had left her to help him pay off his debts. During the months, he fell into despair and wanted to give up. She was the one who stayed up all night with him, rewriting every business plan. When he couldn't afford an office, she turned their small living room into a workspace. When he lost faith in himself, she was the only one who looked him in the eyes and said, "One day, you'll walk into the brightest places in Lagos, but please don't forget where you came from." Back then, Chinadu held her hand and made promises. He said that if he ever became rich, the first person he would thank would be Ada. He said that if life gave him everything, he would never trade her for anything in the world. But some promises made by men only live until money begins to speak. As his business took off, as major contracts came flooding in, as luxury parties became more frequent, China began to change. At first, it was just coming home late, then secret phone calls, then unusually long business trips. After that came unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, hastily deleted messages, and a coldness in his eyes whenever Ada asked questions that came too close to the truth. Ada was not foolish. She saw everything, but she remained silent, not because she was weak, but because somewhere inside her still lived the memory of the man he used to be, the man who once held her hand in a dark room and said that without her, he would be nothing. Ada waited. She waited for Chinedu to wake up, to remember who he once was, to let whatever was left of his conscience return, before everything went too far. But what returned was not his conscience. It was a divorce filing. One morning, as Ada sat quietly in the spacious kitchen of their mansion, a housemaid brought her a brown envelope. Inside were perfectly prepared legal documents, cold, precise, leaving no room for error. Chinedu had even handed them to her himself. He let his lawyers do it, as if avoiding touching something he had already deemed worthless. That same day, Ada discovered another truth: every major asset they had built together had already been quietly transferred into his name or placed under shell companies months earlier. The apartments, the investments, the shares, the cash flow, even the very first piece of land she had helped him buy, everything had been pulled out of her reach through a carefully calculated plan. This was not a divorce born out of pain. It was a purge. Chinedu didn't want to leave Ada quietly. He wanted to crush her, to turn the woman who knew him too well into someone broken, powerless, and publicly humiliated. He hired the most expensive legal team in Lagos, lawyers known not for justice, but for their ability to bend truth into whatever best served their client. The courtroom that day had been staged like a performance. On one side was him, successful, composed, polished, shielded by thick case files and sharp legal minds. On the other side was Ada, quiet in a simple dress, barely wearing makeup, sitting in the courtroom like a shadow of the past. But what Chinedu wanted wasn't just the assets. He wanted to destroy her dignity. In front of the judge, the lawyers, the press, and everyone present, he wanted Ada to appear as nothing more than a useless burden, a dependent wife, incapable, undeserving of anything from the fortune she had spent her youth helping to build. And to do that, Chinedu chose the cruelest method. He stood up in the courtroom, adjusted his cuff, and looked at Ada as if she were nothing more than an outdated object. Then, with the smooth tone of someone who had rehearsed every word in advance, he began to speak about her as if she were a mistake. He said she contributed nothing of value. He said she lacked any understanding of business. He said his success came solely from his own abilities, and that Ada had done nothing but live off the Okafor name. Each sentence landed like a carefully sharpened blade. Ada did not argue. She simply sat there, hands clenched tightly, eyes lowered. No one knew how many pieces she was breaking into inside. Because there are pains too deep to turn into tears, they don't explode outward. They burn quietly within. Then the courtroom door opened. An elderly woman stepped in slowly, wearing worn-out clothes, old sandals, and holding a market bag as if she had just walked in from a poor marketplace somewhere in Lagos, into a place she did not belong. It was Ada's mother. She didn't understand much about the law. She wasn't used to cold rooms, filled with power like this. She only knew that her daughter was being judged in the trial of her own life, and that a mother, no matter how poor, must be present when her child needs her. Chinedu turned to look at her. For a brief moment, someone might have thought he would hold on to what little dignity he had left. But no, he laughed. A loud laugh, one that echoed across the entire courtroom. And then he said the words that froze the air. "Your Honor, that is exactly where she comes from. a filthy vegetable seller from the market, and she's no better than that. This time, even those who had been watching with curiosity fell silent, because people can witness disputes over property. They can hear bitter accusations between husband and wife. But to watch a man, once praised as successful, stand in a courtroom and publicly trample the dignity of the woman who stood beside him through poverty and insult her mother as if she were less than human, that was no longer divorce. That was moral decay exposed in public, and Chinadu had no idea that the very moment he believed he was winning most gloriously was the exact moment fate began to turn against him. Chinadu's lawyer rose slowly, as if he understood that every second stretched inside that courtroom only gave his client more time to savor the feeling of victory. The thick stack of documents hit the table with a dull, cold thud. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at Ada with the detached look of someone long accustomed to turning other people as pain into legal arguments, then faced the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and unwavering, "my client requests full ownership of all current assets, as throughout the marriage, the wife made no substantial contribution to the creation or growth of said assets." The entire room fell into a suffocating silence. All eyes turned toward Ada, not with sympathy, but with that familiar mix of curiosity and judgment, the kind of gaze society reserves for a woman sitting on the weaker side, dressed simply, with no one left to defend her, about to be turned into a living example of failure. Ada lifted her head. For a brief moment, something like terror flashed across her face, a crack running through the last, fragile layer holding her together. Her lips trembled. Her hands, resting on her lap, clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. "That's not true," she said, her voice small but urgent, as if 1 second slower and the truth of her entire life would be buried in that room. "That's not true." Shut up." Chinadu's voice exploded through the air like a slap. Ada flinched. Even a few people in the back row instinctively tensed at the sheer force and cruelty in his tone. Chinadu was no longer maintaining any trace of civility. The expensive suit, the neatly styled hair, the luxury watch on his wrist, everything that once made him look like a refined, successful man, suddenly became meaningless. Because now what stood out was not his status, but the raw nature beneath the polished surface. He took a step forward. Just one step. But it felt like it landed directly on Ada's chest. "What exactly did you do, huh?" He spat, his eyes fixed on her, as if she were beneath even the right to speak. "You lived in my house, spent my money, carried my name, and now you sit there pretending you contributed something." Ada opened her mouth, but no words came out. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had too much. She wanted to talk about those early years in a cramped rental room, suffocating in the heat, leaking in the rain. She wanted to talk about the nights Chinadu sat frozen in front of unpaid bills, while she quietly walked into another room, removed the last pair of earrings her mother had left her, and sold them. She wanted to talk about quitting her stable job to build his company from nothing, about the days she packed products by hand, kept the books, answered customer calls, managed meals, appointments, expenses, about the times he collapsed under pressure, and she was the one who stayed beside him until morning, gathering the shattered pieces of his pride, putting them back together and handing them to him so he could walk out and face the world as a strong man again. She wanted to say all of it, but the cruelest part of humiliation is this. It can leave a person holding an entire lifetime of truth and still unable to speak. Ada's throat tightened. A tear fell before she could stop it. Chinadu saw it. And instead of stopping like a man who still had a trace of conscience, he smiled. A cold smile that made several people in the room instinctively look away, as if staring any longer would make them ashamed of themselves. Then he turned to the right, where Ada's mother stood. The old woman still held her market bag. The straps were worn thin. The edge of her faded clothes moved slightly under the slow rotation of the ceiling fan above. Her face showed neither anger nor fear, only a quietness so profound, one that usually belongs to those who have endured so much hardship that they understand some storms need to be fought with raised voices. But Chindu didn't understand that silence. Or perhaps he did and chose to trample it anyway. And you? His voice hardened. His arm lifted. His finger pointed straight at his mother-in-law. A gesture so aggressive that someone near the door gasped sharply. A poor, filthy vegetable seller, he said, each word falling like dirty water, splashed onto someone's dignity. What exactly did you teach your daughter? To cling to a man, to cry for sympathy, to live like someone dragged out of a stinking marketplace. No one laughed this time. No one dared. The air in the courtroom seemed to solidify into something heavy, pressing down on everyone present. Even the court clerk, who had been writing, paused mid-sentence. A woman seated to the left covered her mouth. A middle-aged man at the back frowned deeply, his curiosity now replaced with discomfort. Because when a man humiliates his wife, that is cruelty. But when he publicly tramples the dignity of her elderly mother, a woman standing there, in worn sandals, holding a market bag, that is no longer anger. That is brutality. It felt as though all strength had been drained from Ada's body. She bent forward, not dramatically, but like someone collapsing from within. Her shoulders shook. Her hands came up to cover her face. As she tried to suppress the sobs breaking free, her hair fell over half her pale face. The woman, who once stood beside Chinidu through every hardship, who had witnessed all his failures and successes, was now shrinking in the middle of the courtroom like a child thrown into the chaos of the world with nowhere left to hide. And yet, the woman beside her, her mother, did not move. She remained still. No reaction. No anger. No stepping forward. No pleading. No trembling. Just silence. A silence so strange it made the entire courtroom more uneasy than Ada's quiet sobbing. She stood like an old tree in a storm, perhaps bent, perhaps weathered, but with roots too deep to be torn out by a few cruel words. Her eyes slowly lifted to Chinadu, not with hatred, not with bitterness, but with a gaze that made it seem as though she saw something in him that he himself could not see. The terrifying poverty of a man who believed he had everything but was, in truth, stripped bare in the most pitiful way. Because there are people who are poor in money, and there are people who are poor in character. The second kind is the one nothing can save. Lost in his arrogance, Chindu failed to realize that her silence was shrinking him in the eyes of everyone in that room. Every insult he threw did just wound Ada. It hammered against the image of success he had spent years building. His suit was still expensive. His watch still gleamed. His lawyer still sat there. The files were still neatly arranged on the table. But none of it made him look bigger anymore. On the contrary, the more he spoke, the smaller he became. The more aggressive he grew, the heavier the silence of the two women before him turned like an invisible indictment, pressing down on him. Ada remained bent forward, her tears falling soundlessly. Her mother stood still, holding her worn market bag. And the entire courtroom, though no one said it out loud, seemed to feel something slowly spreading through every row, that this moment was no longer just the climax of a divorce case. It was the moment a man tore off his own mask in front of the world. And that silent old woman had not spoken a single word, yet her silence was the most terrifying thing in the room. Because sometimes, life does not answer with a scream. It simply stands there and lets an arrogant man say every word he will one day have to pay for. The judge's wooden gavel struck the bench. Order. The sound cracked through the room, sharp, dry, commanding, as if it should have been enough to force everything back in the cold structure of a legal proceeding. But in truth, it could not erase what had just happened inside that courtroom. It could not take back the insults Chinadu had hurled at his wife. It could not wipe away the pain Written across Ada's face, Ada, who was still bent forward, her shoulders trembling in small, broken waves, as if even breathing now required more strength than she had left. The air in the Legos courtroom turned thick. The spectators sat in silence, but it was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the heavy silence that follows the tearing apart of a moral boundary, right in a place that was supposed to represent justice. No one looked at each other. They looked ahead toward the successful man, standing in his expensive suit, still breathing hard with the last fumes of triumph, perhaps not even realizing that from this moment on, the room no longer leaned in his favor, the way it had only minutes before, because at that very moment, the old woman stepped forward. No one told her to. No one helped her. There was no music, no warning, no visible sign that this moment was coming. There was only an elderly woman in faded clothes, worn sandals on her feet, quietly leaving her place and walking into the center of a courtroom that had gone completely still, step by step, slow, steady, so clear that the soft slap of her rubber sandals against the polished floor sounded like its own rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was not a loud sound, but in the absolute stillness of the room, it rang out like a knock against the conscience of everyone present. Each step seemed to cut through what remained of the arrogance in Chinadu's eyes. Each one forced the room to look again at the woman he had mocked only minutes earlier as a filthy vegetable seller from the market. Ada lifted her head. Tears still clung to her face. Her eyes were red, blurred with pain. But when she saw her mother walking forward, something appeared in her expression that was difficult to name. It was not exactly hope. She had been hopeless for too long. It was not exactly fear either, though she knew every step her mother took now would place her at the center of every judging eye in the room. Perhaps it was simply the feeling of a daughter who knew her mother too well. Her mother was not a woman who spoke unless she had to. And if a woman like her had chosen to step forward, then something greater than humiliation itself must have brought her there. Chinadu looked at her first with surprise, then quickly, with the familiar contempt returning to his face. He tilted his head slightly, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, as though were watching something foolish and unimportant. To him, this old woman was making a pointless move in a place ruled by people who understood law, power, and money. In his mind, she was nothing more than a misplaced figure who had wandered into a world that was never meant for her. But she kept walking. She did not look at him. She did not glance at his lawyer. She did not turn back toward her daughter. She walked straight ahead, into the open space at the center of the courtroom, where the white overhead light fell most clearly. Then, before the eyes of everyone present, she bent down and placed the vegetable bag she had carried since the beginning of the hearing onto the floor. The old bag touched the ground very lightly, but the sound made several people stop breathing, because, in that instant, the bag no longer looked like a symbol of poverty. It became something harder to define. A pause, a door about to open, a sign that this woman had not stepped forward to cry or beg. Her thin hand slipped into the bag. Chinidu remained standing, but his eyes narrowed slightly. His lawyer sat up straighter, as if sensing that this was not about to be some ordinary emotional outburst. Even the judge, seated high above, lowered his gaze with a more focused seriousness than before. The old woman pulled out a worn file, not a messy bundle of papers tied together carelessly, the way people often imagine the possessions of poor market women. This was a file that had been preserved with care. The edges of the cover had aged with time, but the documents inside were flat, neatly arranged, every corner bearing the marks of long and deliberate protection. She held it with both hands, slowly, firmly, as though what lay inside was not just paperwork, but memory, labor, and the dignity of an entire life. Then she raised her head. "Your Honor." Her voice entered the room. Low, clear, unusually calm. It did not shake. It did not catch in her throat. It did not rise in anger. This was not the voice of someone begging for mercy, nor was it the voice of a desperate mother lashing out because she had been cornered. It was the voice of someone who had endured long enough, understood the cost of silence too well, and had now simply decided to place the truth on the table. The room seemed to lean toward her. Even Ada stopped sobbing. Chinadu blinked once quickly, but enough to expose the first hairline fracture. In the armored confidence he had been wearing like a second skin, I asked for permission to say a few words. The sentence was not loud, but it moved through the courtroom like a blade, slicing a line between two worlds. On one side, Chinadu's loud, aggressive display of money and power. On the other, the almost unsettling calm of the woman he had just called a poor vegetable seller. And it was precisely because of that calm that the first reaction did not come from the judge. It came from Chinedu's lawyer. He let out a dry laugh, short, dismissive, mocking, as if he could restore the familiar balance of the courtroom simply by pushing this woman back down into the lowly place he believed she belonged. "Do you think this is a marketplace?" The words were cold. A few people lowered their eyes, not in agreement, but because the arrogance in the remark had gone too far. Strangely enough, only minutes earlier, some people in the room had laughed along with Chinadu when he humiliated his mother-in-law. But now, no one laughed. When cruelty is repeated too many times, it stops being entertaining. It simply reveals the face of the person wielding it as a weapon. The old woman turned to look at the lawyer. Not angry, not confused, not intimidated. Her gaze was so quiet and directed that the man accustomed to overpowering others with language suddenly felt his sarcasm drop into empty space, producing none of the effect he had expected. And before he could say another word, the judge raised a hand. The gesture was quick, decisive, and small, but it immediately cut through the contempt beginning to spread from Chinidua's table. "Let her speak." The courtroom fell silent again, but this silence was different from the one before. It was no longer the stunned hush that follows humiliation. It was anticipation. Attention stretched tight as a wire because everyone seemed to sense the same thing at once. That the old woman with the vegetable bag had not come forward merely to defend her daughter with a few emotional words. She had not stepped up with red eyes and choked sobs. She had stepped forward with a file in her hands and a composure unsettling enough to make those who were used to winning with raised voices suddenly uncomfortable. Chinidu shifted his stance, only slightly, but enough to notice. His shoulders were no longer fully relaxed. The hand at his side tightened once. He looked at his mother-in-law more carefully, now not as a poor market woman who had wandered into a world of status, but as an unknown variable he had failed to account for in his perfect plan. Ada stared at her mother, her breath caught in her chest. Memories came crashing back of mornings when her mother rose before sunrise, carrying vegetables to the market through rain and heat, through back pain, through sandals worn so thin the straps had broken more than once, and still she slipped them back on and kept walking. All her life, she had never entered any room demanding justice for herself. She only knew how to work, endure, save, and sacrifice. And yet today, in a courtroom where everything was measured by status and reputation, that woman stood straighter than anyone else. That straight-backed dignity did not come from power. It came from something greater than power. The truth. The old woman lowered her eyes to the file in her hands, then looked up once more. Her thin fingers rested against the worn papers, but they did not tremble. Her face remained calm. She did not look like someone entering a battle out of desperation. On the contrary, she looked like someone who had carried this through many years, waiting only for the right day, the right place, the right moment to open it. And, in that instant, the entire courtroom, from the spectators in the back row, to the court clerk, to both legal teams, to Chinedu himself, felt as though an invisible door had just opened. No one knew what was inside that old file, but everyone knew one thing. This trial was no longer going to follow the script Chinedu had written for it. Because sometimes, the most underestimated person in the room is the only one who steps forward, not to beg for mercy, but to change everything. The old woman stood in the middle of the courtroom, her thin hands resting on the worn file as though she were holding not just a stack of papers, but the part of the truth that had been buried for years beneath the dust of poverty, silence, and contempt. The room remained suffocatingly still. No one spoke. Even Chinedu, the man who only minutes earlier had stood in court, as though he owned every gaze, every judgment, every outcome, did not interrupt her now. He was still standing there, but the smirk had vanished. His eyes no longer carried that easy contempt from before. Somewhere inside those widening pupils, the first crack had appeared. Slowly, she opened the file. The soft sound of paper, turning, barely rose above a whisper. But in the eerie stillness of the room, it sounded like a heavy iron door, slowly opening after years of being locked shut. She pulled out the first document, then the second, then the third, page by page. No rush, no panic, no theatrics. The way she handled the papers made it seem as though she had lived with them for far too long, touched them through too many silent nights, until every corner, every line, every seal carried the warmth of a memory that had never truly cooled. She lifted the first page, Okafor Holdings. Her voice rose calm, low, and clear. No one dared laugh anymore. The moment that name entered the room, the entire courtroom seemed to tense at once. Because that was not the name of some small shop, nor an unknown company. It was the business empire Chinedu had used to build his status in Lagos, the thing that made people call him successful. The foundation of the luxurious life he had just stood before the court demanding to own completely. She looked down at the paper. Was established 12 years ago. Her tone did not change. It did not rise. It did not harden. But that very calmness made each word land, heavier than stone. A few people in the back row leaned forward. Chiniju's lawyer frowned slightly. He still sat upright, but the hand resting on the table had stiffened. The court clerk looked up fully now, no longer taking notes, as if professional instinct had already told him that this was no longer an ordinary emotional turn in the proceedings. The old woman raised her eyes. This time, she looked straight at Chinedu, not with hatred, not with fear, not even with the satisfaction of revenge, only with a gaze so calm, so steady, that it made the person facing her feel more suffocated than any scream ever could. With the initial investment, she paused for exactly 1 second, not long, but long enough for the entire room to hold its breath with her. It was my money. The room split open. A murmur broke from the spectators' benches before anyone could stop it. It was not loud, but it spread fast, like a spark landing in dry grass. The eyes that had just moments ago looked at her as a poor woman out of place in a courtroom suddenly changed. Shock, disbelief, suspicion, and then confusion. Ada lifted her head completely. Tears still clung to the corners of her eyes, but the expression on her face was no longer one of despair. She looked at her mother as though realizing, for the first time, that there was an entire hidden territory in her mother's life, even she had never touched. And Chinedu, he stepped back half a pace, very quickly, but not quickly enough to hide it. That's impossible. For the first time since the hearing began, his voice was no longer steady. The words came out more like reflex than argument, as if what he had just heard did not merely make him object, it made him afraid. The old woman did not turn to respond. She continued as though she had always known that truth, when spoken at the right moment, does not need much debate. It simply needs to be laid before everyone. I cannot read, she said. A few people in the room blinked, because in this moment, that sentence sounded almost contradictory. The woman he had called a poor, filthy vegetable seller, the woman, now admitting she could not read, was standing in court with documents tied to her son-in-law's biggest company. But then she continued, "But I know how to sign my name." No one breathed too loudly anymore. She did not need to say it loudly. It still passed through the room like a cold needle. No flourish, no defense. Just a plain, Brutal truth the kind poor people often have to learn with blood and bone. You may not be able to read everything in this world, but you must know how to leave your mark on what belongs to you. She pulled from the file a contract yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully, smoothly, as though she had protected it through rain, heat, through long market days, through bad harvest seasons, through all the years when no one in that room today had bothered to imagine that a woman like her might be preserving something powerful enough to reverse the direction of an entire trial. She placed the contract on the bench before the judge. The seal appeared first, dark, clear, valid. Then came the signature pages, and in the place no one expected was her name. Not at the margin, not on some minor witness line, not as the recipient of money or some anonymous guarantor, but in a position that made the color drain from Chinadu's lawyer's face in an instant. Majority shareholder. The air shattered into a horrifying silence. Perhaps it was one of the most frightening forms of silence, when too many people have all seen something so clearly that no one even knows how to doubt it anymore. Chinadu's lawyer bent down abruptly. He snatched up his glasses, pulled them closer, and stared at the contract as though if he looked hard enough, the words might disappear. But they did not disappear. The seal was still there. The signature was still there. The ownership percentage was still there. Everything remained neat, cold, and legally sound in the most merciless way possible for those who had built an entire strategy to strip someone bare in open court. The judge leaned forward. It was only a small movement, but it made the entire room go even stiller. He took the document and turned the pages with the care of someone who understood that sometimes a single valid line on paper weighs more than 100 emotional testimonies. The rustle of paper filled the room. Clear, measured, slow. The whole courtroom waited. Ada covered her mouth with one hand. She was not crying out loud, but her eyes widened more and more with every page the judge examined. In her mind, pieces of memory began crashing into one another. Mornings when her mother left for the market before dawn, the times she quietly slipped money to the newlyweds, the evasive answers whenever Ada asked why she never saved more for her own old age, the years she lived more harshly than she should have as though she had once poured out a large part of her resources and told no one. Suddenly everything had shape. Suddenly every sacrifice had proof. And Chinadu was no longer standing inside the arrogance he had worn at the beginning. He stared at the contract as though it were the strangest object he had ever seen, even though he, of all people, should have known where his company began. His face went pale, not the pale of a man being insulted, but the pale of someone who had just realized that the foundation he had been standing on for years did not belong to him the way he had always assumed. Perhaps his mind was now frantically searching through old memories. The day the company first opened, the funds that appeared at exactly the right time, the paperwork delivered when he was too consumed by ambition to look closely, the times Ada spoke of her mother with gratitude, and he brushed it aside, all of it now, returning like shards of broken glass, flying straight at him. His lawyer looked up. For the first time in the entire hearing, the man no longer looked in control. A thin layer of sweat had begun to gather at his temples. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came immediately, because a lawyer's first professional instinct, when facing damaging evidence, is to find the flaw. But this document, at least at first glance, did not look like a flaw. It looked like a bomb buried for 12 years and detonated in the middle of the courtroom. The judge turned to the final page. He stopped, looked closely, then raised his head. His expression no longer carried the simple authority of someone maintaining order in a hearing. It was the expression of a man who had just realized that this supposedly straightforward divorce case was hiding an ownership structure entirely different from what the petitioner had presented. This is a valid legal document. The words came down with finality. No raised voice. No dramatic emphasis. Shh. But they struck the room like an invisible hammer crashing straight into the performance Chinadu had staged from the very beginning. A woman in the back row inhaled sharply. Someone dropped a pen. Another person leaned back in their chair as though they had just witnessed something too sudden to absorb. And then, the entire courtroom fell silent. No more whispers. No more shifting chairs. No more cheap curiosity. Only absolute stillness, the kind that exists only when the entire balance of power has been overturned by a truth too large to ignore. The old woman still stood there. Her faded clothes were still worn. Her sandals were still thin. Her vegetable bag was still on the floor. But now, no one looked at her as a poor vegetable seller anymore. Because some people move through life looking so ordinary that the world assumes they are small. Until one day, the truth opens, and everyone realizes that the person they looked down on was the one quietly holding everything up from behind. Chinadu stood in the middle of the courtroom, wearing his expensive suit, before the best lawyer, before the judge, before everyone. And for the first time, he looked smaller than ever. Not because the old woman had shouted at him, not because Ada had fought back, but because the papers on that bench had spoken for them all. And once the truth finds its voice, human pride can do nothing but retreat into silence. Chinadu stood in the middle of the courtroom, as if the ground beneath his feet had just been pulled away. Only minutes earlier, he had still been the man controlling the entire game. He had walked into court in an expensive suit, with a powerful legal team, wearing the smile of someone who believed everything in life could be bent by money, status, and cold calculation. He had looked at Ada as if she were an old object with no value left. He had looked at his mother-in-law as if she were a lowly woman fit only to stand in a marketplace. He had spoken, laughed, humiliated, and crushed with the confidence of a man who believed he could not possibly lose. But now, everything in his eyes was gone. All that remained was the raw panic of a man who had just seen the proud castle he had spent years building begin to crack at its foundation. No, his lips trembled. His voice came out low, dry, barely recognizable as the same voice that had shouted through the courtroom. This can TB. He stepped back half a pace, then another, as if moving far enough away from the table where the file lay could somehow save him from the truth now exposed. But truth is not something a person can escape with a few steps. It stood there cold, lawful, undeniable, visible in every seal, every signature, every line of text, that not even his best lawyer could twist. The man who had held his head high in contempt of everyone in the room, now trembled like someone who had lost everything. Not because he had become poor in an instant, but because he had just realized something more terrifying than poverty. He no longer had control over the story of his own life. At the bench, the judge closed the file. The sound was not loud, but it landed like a final period in the frozen room. The judge's face remained stern, but now there was not a trace of patience left for the arrogant performance Chinadu had put on earlier. After everything that had just unfolded, no one could mistake the difference between the person speaking through truth and the man who had used humiliation to hide greed. The judge's voice rang out, clear and precise, stripped of emotion, but every word fell like a hammer. The court recognizes the submitted documents as legally valid. The air in the room tightened even more. Based on the ownership records and the original share distribution of Okafor Holdings, along with the supporting evidence reviewed during this hearing, he paused. No one dared move. The assets in question must be reconsidered and redistributed according to the lawful rights of the respective parties. A silent shockwave rippled through the gallery, but the judge was not finished. As for control of the company, this time, even Chinadu stopped breathing. It belongs to the principal shareholder. A silence fell, and inside that silence, everyone in the room knew exactly who had just been named. Not Chinadu, not his legal team, not the name he had used to intimidate people for years. But the elderly woman standing there, the woman in worn sandals, the woman he had just called a filthy vegetable seller, the woman he thought he could step on without consequence. And that person, the judge continued, under the documents currently in legal force, is you. No one needed to ask who you meant. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward Ada's mother. The world, in that instant, seemed to flip entirely upside down. The woman who had stood quietly through most of the hearing, speaking only when truth required it, had now become the center of legal authority in the room. Not through display, not through expensive clothing, not through a loud voice, but through years of silent sacrifice. No one had cared enough to notice. Ada looked at her mother, tears streaming down her face. This time, they were not tears of humiliation. They were the tears of a daughter finally, seeing the full depth of the sacrifice her mother had hidden all her life. For years, Ada had only known that her mother worked hard, that she was poor, that she woke before dawn, carried vegetables to market, saved every coin, and lived quietly like millions of other women across Lagos. She had never known that behind that worn, weathered life, her mother had quietly given her an entire foundation. Not just enough to help her daughter escape poverty, but enough to build the very empire people now thought belonged to Chinedu. The old woman turned to look at her daughter. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, no joy of revenge, only a deep exhaustion, the exhaustion of a woman who had endured too many years in silence, and who today had been forced to bring the truth into the light, not to destroy anyone, but to save her daughter from being buried alive under injustice. She gently placed a hand on Ada's shoulder. It was the lightest touch, but it was enough to quiet every sob inside Ada all at once. No words of blame. No "I told you so." Not a single complaint. Because some forms of a mother's love do not need to be proven with words. They only need to appear at the exact moment her child is about to collapse and hold her up. Ada closed her eyes, her lips trembling. In that moment, in a room filled with law and power, her mother's touch was the thing that made her feel saved more than anything else. And Chinedu. He could no longer hear the whispers around him clearly. His ears rang. Before him, the faces that had once been an audience for his cruelty had changed. Some looked at him with disgust, some with icy distance. Some did not even bother to hide their contempt. He had wanted to turn Ada into a helpless woman in front of the public. But in the end, the one stripped bare before the crowd was him. One mask after another fell away. Successful businessman, wronged husband, man with a parasitic wife. All of it dissolved. What remained was only a greedy, ungrateful, cruel man standing in the very place he had planned to use to crush someone else. His knees weakened. At first, he staggered. Then he could no longer hold himself up. And before the eyes of the entire courtroom, Chinedu fell to his knees. No arrogance left. No control left. Only a man thrown off the imaginary throne he had built for himself. "I am sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I am sorry, please give me one more chance." No one answered. Not because they had not heard him, but because some apologies arrived too late. Some doors, once kicked open by insult and betrayal, cannot be closed again with a few frantic tears. Ada did not look at him. The woman he had shouted "shut up" at in open court no longer needed to look him in the face. She had cried enough, endured enough, wasted too many years waiting for some fragment of conscience to return to him. But today, she understood one bitter truth. What he feared was not hurting her. What he feared was losing control, losing money, losing status, losing what he thought was his. Her mother did not answer him either. She slowly removed her hand from Ada's shoulder, bent down, and picked up the vegetable bag at her feet. That image tightened something in the entire room. Because after everything, the woman who now legally controlled a major company still bent down to pick up her market bag as if she had never been anyone other than a mother who went to the market every morning. That was exactly what made her greater than all of Chinedu's suits, glass offices, and boasts. Then she turned away, not quickly, not slowly, just calmly walking past the man kneeling on the floor, without looking down, without stopping, without giving him even the dignity of a final judgment. Because sometimes the greatest punishment is not being yelled at or avenged. It is being left behind inside the ruins you created with your own hands. Ada rose and followed her mother. The two women walked through the courtroom, which remained silent as stone. People on either side shifted slightly to make way. No one had to say anything, yet everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing not just the end of a divorce case, but the moment Karma itself had walked in wearing worn sandals, carrying an old vegetable bag, and holding a file preserved through 12 hard years. Behind them, Chinadu remained on his knees. His suit was still expensive. His shoes were still polished. But now, those things only made him look more pathetic. Because money can buy lawyers. Status can buy fear. But no one can buy back a betrayed past. No one can buy the years of sacrifice made by a mother. And no one can buy forgiveness after trampling the dignity of the person who quietly laid the very road you were allowed to walk on. The courtroom doors opened. Light from outside poured in. Mother and daughter walked out without looking back. Shin sighed. The man who had laughed the loudest was left with nothing but the sound of his own, heavy breathing in a silence no one broke. Because life may allow an arrogant man to stand high for a while, but if he forgets who laid the first brick beneath his feet, then one day, the place where he stood tallest will become the place where he falls the hardest. And karma, it truly never comes early, but it is never late. There are people you look at them and quickly judge them as insignificant. Just because they don't speak much, don't fight back, don't step forward to compete. But you forget one thing. Silence is not always weakness. Some silence comes from having seen too much to waste words, comes from being strong enough not to prove anything to anyone. And sometimes, it means they are waiting for the right moment. The moment when the truth is revealed. Not shouted loudly, yet powerful enough to make the entire world fall silent. Don't be so quick to look down on someone just because they stand behind. Don't be so quick to judge someone just because they don't react right away. Because there are people, when they finally step forward, they not there to argue. They there to change everything. If you've made it this far, ask yourself, how many times in your life have you misjudged someone just because they were silent? And if you believe that karma always comes, sooner or later, stay with us for the next stories, because some truths are only told to those patient enough to hear them to the very end.